I'm Joanne Peppers. I'm the manager curator at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The gas mask that I brought in today was donated to the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in 1967 by Mr. Cyril Johnson. And the only notation that we had about it was that it was one of the first gas masks used in World War I.
Previously fought on relatively contained scales and contested between professionally trained soldiers, in 1914, a new war would call upon civilian volunteers with no previous military experience to take up arms, and would expose them to unprecedented horrors. Many new methods of warfare debuted during World War I. On April 22, 1915, the Germans released 160 tons of chlorine gas over Ypres, Belgium, and onto French and Algerian soldiers. The deadly attack was repeated 2 days later, with Allied troops as the target. The Allies developed multiple versions of protective gear, but under the threat of chemical violence, total protection was never achieved. With almost 30 million gas masks circulated before the war's end, chemical attacks would still account for an estimated 100,000 deaths and unspeakable suffering.
Joanne, welcome to Militaria today.
Thank you.
And what can you tell us about your artifact?
I have brought in a gas mask today. It was one of the first gas masks used in World War I.
This is an iconic piece of First World War history. When I look at something like this, it kind of sends shivers down my spine. For me, that artifact totally embodies the horror of the First World War. The suffering that would be involved in someone that was exposed to gas. I think it was something like 12,000 Canadians were victims of gas attacks. You have here basically a very rudimentary gas mask. It's missing just a little piece that's right here. Basically, you would just put it over your head and you would try and tuck it into your uniform in the hopes that you would be safe from the chlorine or phosgene gas. Of course, it didn't always work because it could become untucked. There were still lots of casualties as a result. It was a better protection than nothing, but not much better.
What strikes me is the eyes. Your vision must have been almost nothing.
Very limited, and also the sense of isolation that must have come over a lot of soldiers. So the psychology aspect of the mask, that's almost as bad as the actual gas. When you think about the sense of isolation that one would feel, having to wear that for hours on end without having serious contact with your colleagues, it must have been horrible for soldiers. I can only imagine what they must have felt. It must have been horrible, and that to me would be the most dreaded aspect of the First World War. What kind of information do you have about the previous owner or the original owner of this artifact? Do you have any documentation?
So I looked a little bit more into Cyril Johnson's family. I'm wondering, did Cyril own the mask? Was it from someone he knew, or did he simply find this and think it was interesting for the museum? What I found out was that Cyril had a brother named James, and James served in World War I. So I went to a history book that we have called In the Wake of the Alderney by Harry Chapman, just on the off chance that he might be mentioned in the book, and he was. What Harry Chapman captured was a letter that James wrote home while he was serving in World War I. Our major was the very last man to leave the trench, and as we passed him, he told everyone to keep low and run for it. How I got through, I don't know. 2 bullets went through my pack I was carrying, and later I was struck in the side. The iron entrenching tool I was carrying saved me. The bullet glanced off, denting the tool and stunning me a bit. James was killed in action. So the brother was about 5 years younger, the brother named Cyril, who donated this mask to the museum. After the death of his brother, he still signed up to participate, which really struck me on the human side of things.
Cyril came back and he was able to live a relatively normal life as far as you can...
as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have a whole lot of information about him, but the fact that he had this, he kept it, thought it was worthy to donate to a museum. I did see in James's will of sorts that his brother Cyril got the belongings from his kit, so that may have been how Cyril ended up with his brother's gas mask here. Seeing this gas mask kind of opened that door of finding out more about what life was like during World War I, and just learning more about the families who responded to that call to go to war and what it was like for them.
Do you know much about the history of gas warfare?
Not really.
The beginnings of gas in the First World War actually started in 1914. The French were the first to use gas. It was a non-lethal gas. It was like a tear gas. The Second Battle of Ypres, 1915, April of 1915, was the first appearance of chlorine gas. What chlorine gas does is whenever it comes into contact with something that's liquid, it turns into like an acid and does horrible things to eyes and lungs. So the Germans were the first to use the lethal gas, and it was against the Canadians and Commonwealth troops at the Second Battle of Ypres. After that, they switched to phosgene, which basically would fill the lungs with liquid, and you would almost drown in liquid. And then towards the end of the war, about 1917, they switched to mustard gas. Mustard gas was probably the worst of it because even if you had a mask on, it would burn you, it would cause blisters throughout the skin. This is a pH helmet, so this is going to be the second pattern of gas mask that was used. The hypo helmet was the first, and then about late 16, 17, they came out with a small box respirator. So that's a bit of the evolution of gas and protection of it during the First World War. In 1925, there was the Geneva Collective that stipulated that these countries would no longer use gas, and all signatories to that refrained from using gas because it was such a horrible, horrible weapon to use. And indeed, it was not used during the Second World War. Joanne, thanks for bringing in this iconic piece of First World War history. What does the future hold for this artifact?
Well, currently this is part of our museum collection. It has actually led to a lot of questions about World War I. So it's kind of opened up a research avenue for us.
Well, I think that's great. I mean, I think when people see this, they may not necessarily recognize it right away for what it is. And if it starts to open up questions about the First World War, I think that's fantastic, yeah. I think it could almost make a display on its own and could really speak to the horrors of the First World War.
I really enjoyed my time with Andrew today. He shed a light on a side of history that I don't actually know a whole lot about, especially the use of gas as a weapon. So I definitely learned a lot more about the gas mask and a little bit about the history of warfare.